Welcome to the BPM IT Security Advisory FedRAMP series. Last time we discussed the FedRAMP timeline and some of the documents for FedRAMP, and today we're going to discuss documentation in action, starting with the SSP. So when you're considering FedRAMP authorization, a lot of questions come to mind, and in this series, Lauren Bodie and myself hope to put our knowledge together for you and our last 6 years and 9+ customers in pursuing FedRAMP. So we start out with what we call documentation in action, and that's where the SSP comes into play. A lot of people hear about the SSP, the System Security Plan, and they hear about that it's this one giant document, and maybe they're considering hiring a contractor to put this one document together, but this huge document does come over to us as a template, and it's provided by FedRAMP at fedramp.gov/templates. But it is actually one of 30 templates that go together. Many of them must be used, not even formatted differently, except for changing of the content might be a little bit different. And this huge document can end up being hundreds of pages long. So Lauren, why don't you tell us about, at a high level, how we started with many customers prepping for such a huge document, possibly over a year or more's worth of work?
Yeah, it is, it is a massive undertaking. I think we touched on it a little bit in our previous video, but even before you have put any content into the SSP itself, the low impact is 170 plus pages, moderate is over 300 pages, and high is over 400 pages. And that is template alone. So that's with none of your organization's personalized content. So this becomes a huge document. It has to be submitted in their format. It cannot be chopped up or edited and separately to make it a little bit more manageable. It has to be submitted in this Word format. And you're passing it back and forth, especially if you have comments and track changes. You create this huge embedding thing that you have to keep on your radar. You have to make sure that you are saving constantly and staying on top of your changes constantly, or else you will be in that boat that you're in when it's 1 a.m. right before your final exam paper is due and you forget to save, and then the power goes out and you've lost all your hard work. So you have to make sure you're saving regularly. There are 14 total sections. There's 12 sections before you even start talking about controls themselves. So Sarah's going to just kind of outline those for us as well in a little bit more detail.
So we'll start out with the first section at the top of the document. And again, this document has to be submitted in the format given to us by FedRAMP. And I just want to take a brief pause here to talk about a couple of customers that we have had that have used external products to store the information of their document, thinking that they were going to be able to submit straight from those services. And that's not possible. You still have to put this content back in the template because of the way the FedRAMP documents are read. So check to make sure you're using the template for your final submission. And even though this is a fairly comprehensive document, here we are starting at the page 20 or 30 at the very beginning is nothing but revision history. You're going to start out with 126 lines and you're going to end up with
so much.
Yeah, it really is, because you are going to have a section that you might work on, and you're going to have to update what was changed, who changed it, etc. I just want to call out that the revision history alone is pretty big. And then we move on to sections 1, 2, 3. These are relatively short sections on the exact name of the service, its FedRAMP application number, your overall classification. And it does matter to the SSP that each specific system has a specific classification. In other words, if you have a classification of high and there is a control parameter somewhere that's difficult to meet, you can't just drop the classification there down to low because it's difficult to meet. If you have a classification of high, you're going to get each item type categorized under the CIA, the confidentiality, integrity, availability model, as a low, moderate, or high, and that's where you have to stay. And this is based on the sensitivity level of all the information for you and your customers.
And all that information comes together to make your overall system classification. And like you said, you can't just pick and choose.
And then in section 456, there's some very specific responsible contacts and officials. These are very specific by title, name, address, email, phone, and they stay pretty static. In other words, we can't just put the CISO, we have to put her name or his name or their name, their actual email, their actual phone number, and it stays that way unless that responsible party changes. In a lot of documents, you're putting a role in place. Here, there's a role that's asking for a specific contact. And then in section 7 and 8, we're focused very much on the status of the system. The system being the entire FedRAMP environment that we're talking about, its status, such as whether it's operational or in production, it's under development, it's being modified, or something else. And then what type of cloud model is the service? This is pretty important to establish, as it informs the entire rest of the document and your 3PAL, your third-party authorization official, who is responsible for what parts of the system, not who the individual is, but who, as in the cloud service provider, you, AWS, Azure, Salesforce, etc. Here, who is actually responsible for the cloud portion or the service portion.
Right. And all of the work that you do in that section 7 is going to feed right into section 8, which is where you do talk about the other cloud service providers that you might lean on. If you are going to lean on a CSP that has a FedRAMP authorization of their own, you can actually leverage that, which is referred to as inheritance, which I think we'll talk about in a later video also, but it is very important to know exactly what qualifies as inheritance versus what qualifies as utilizing the vendor services, but still being responsible for the FedRAMP requirements.
Oh yeah, I can't wait to talk about cloud responsibility matrix.
It's in the cloud. It's safe.
Right, it's the cloud. It's all safe. Right. So section 9 goes into the purpose, the components, the boundary, the users, and the network of your system. This is not a place to talk about future features. We see that a lot when people talk about things that they're going to put into the system. This is not that section. And future capabilities. It is the right now end-to-end solution. And this is not a marketing document. We've seen a lot of marketing material placed into this section, and it just needs to come out and start talking tech about these components. The boundary must be an exact diagram, not close, not last year's, not the wrong vendor components, but an exact diagram. It'll be referred to over and over many, many times during the authorization process. All the components, not future components, must be listed here and on the diagram. And the user table may be quite extensive here, or the network architect, where it marries up with the network architectural diagram, and like the boundary, they'll be referred to over and over again. So accuracy is of the utmost importance. And even section 10 is super important with the data flow diagrams, ports and protocols. This is not a list of all ports possible. This is the list of the ports and protocols that are utilized and how they're utilized. And this section will require reviewing with your system and network admins several times, and it's definitely a place for accuracy. And we'll need to keep it up regularly during this time period. When there's a change, it needs to be updated as well. And then you go back to the original revision control section, you update that section, and so forth and so on.
Yeah, it's really important because part of the FedRAMP continuous monitoring and continuous improvement is the review of your inventory, your data flow diagrams, your ports and protocols. You have to keep them up all along the way. And so having it accurate to start, having it be full and complete at the base is really, really important.
Section 11 is often misunderstood. This is the interconnections, where your boundary might sit on or touch or share data with, including service tickets inside and outside of the actual FedRAMP boundary. If you're utilizing another CSP, Maybe it's a ServiceNow to share your tickets. Maybe it's another CSP. You're relying on their application or service to come in or out of the boundary. All these interconnections are listed. Even if you allow an external vendor to use WebEx to come into your system, it might be an interconnection. So this is a super important, often overlooked section. And then there's also section 12, which is laws and regulations. And this is where you're going to spend a lot of time with your legal counsel to make sure you determine all the laws and regulations that apply to your company and to FedRAMP. So this is no small list. A lot of people think that, oh, it's just those FedRAMP, FISMA rules and laws, and they go and make a little copy paste from the latest online laws and regulations document. And even that is pretty long, but may or may not apply to you. So I encourage you to spend a lot of time with your legal counsel. And as I mentioned before, this may take 2 or 3 weeks to nail down this particular section. And then section 13 actually begins the control work. So then the long part starts. Some folks think that section 1 through 12 are very administrative and simple. They're not. They do require being thoughtful, and they find themselves working in this area for several weeks before they actually get to the control set where the fun begins.
Yeah, that is where the fun begins indeed. And depending on your impact level, you could have anywhere from 125 to over 425 controls. It just depends on what impact level you have designated for your system. But each of those controls might have subsections, a part A, B, C, D, some of them all the way to H. So when you think about it from that standpoint, there really are a lot of components to these controls. And you have to address all of those A, B, C's separately. So you can't just summarize your entire response to a control. You have to break it out section by section and say exactly what you do. In addition to that, you have to define the owner of that process or control. You have to define the parameters that might be required by the control. You have to designate your implementation status, whether it is in place or planned, and you have to declare who's responsible for it. So this is kind of where that inheritance comes in. Is it something your organization is responsible for, or is it something that you're leveraging another CSP's FedRAMP authorization for? There's a lot here in the control work, and this is really the part that takes a long time and involves a lot of people and a lot of feedback.
Yeah, I want to make sure everybody caught what Lauren said there, the number of controls being 125 to 425, and then the subsections underneath. This is usually one of the areas that I love to remind people that 125 can easily turn into 355, and that 325 can easily turn into 655, and the 425 can easily turn into 3200. So be careful as you look at the number of controls and subcontrols. When you think it might be small, it might be much larger than a bread box. And look forward to catching us on our next talk where we talk about validating the controls. Now that you've collected all the information, let's see if it's accurate. Let's do something long before the 3PAL auditor asks you to do it. Let's validate each control, do an observation, a screenshot, and ensure that we're doing it over and over again. So catch us on our next call. We'll talk about that.